And where do you want to start, David? Where do we start on fasting and prayer?
Let's kind of start with an overview, really, of where we are now, because we so often, we're aware of where we are, but not aware of where we've been, and we think a lot of things we're doing now are first, and they're really not. So let me kind of take us back, because we are facing the election of our lifetime, there's no question. We're just weeks away, really, from a decision on whether America is going to continue to exist as we've known it in our lifetime and as our fathers have known it. And so that's a momentous decision. I don't think we've ever had an election like this in our lifetime, because we're choosing between two opposite worldviews on the Constitution and on the country. I think you have to go back to the elections of 1856 and 1860 to even get close to the worldview choice we've got this time. Now, the people chose right in that election, but it was a tough time afterwards, and the decision they made saved the Constitution and saved the country. But here we are again with the decision that, in my opinion, is just as momentous as what Americans back then had. Now, we don't often recognize it for what it is now, but there's a lot at stake. And so we need to do exactly what Americans before us have done for 4 centuries, and that's turn to God. We seek His aid, we seek His intervention to change the course of the country. In fact, back on September the 28th, just a few weeks ago, numerous national groups called Americans to pray and fast for the 40 days leading up to the election. Now, tens of thousands of houses of worship and millions of Americans have responded to that call. And in fact, I was blessed to be at the beginning of one of those events. We were in Philadelphia. We were gathered outside on Independence Mall, outside Independence Hall, the birthplace of American liberty, and there were tens of thousands gathered in the crowd on that Saturday, starting the 40 days with a time of corporate prayer and fasting. It was phenomenal. So that time of corporate prayer and fasting, that seems like it's something unfamiliar for our lifetime and activity, but it's really not that long ago that we were doing this. Let me just give you an example. See this? This is part of our national identity. This is a proclamation. This is a national, it says a National Day of Humiliation, Fasting, and Prayer. Now, this is done by the city of Los Angeles. It's an indication of them participating in the national activity of humiliation fast. This is in 1974. And that's not ancient history. I mean, for a lot of us, that's in our lifetime. And why in the world would Congress call the nation to a time of humiliation, fasting, and prayer? In 74, Congress explained that the call to humiliation, fasting, and prayer was in part because we have, quote, we have made such an idol out of our pursuit of national security that we've forgotten that only God can be the ultimate guardian of our true security and safety. Now, that's in 74. Congress is saying, hey, we're forgetting that God is the one who protects us. We've got to go to God. So what Congress did in 1974 was simply continue a practice that had begun in America more than 3.5 centuries earlier than what they did in 74. It was a practice that actually began with the Pilgrims. Now, most folks usually think of the Pilgrims with Thanksgiving, not with humiliation, fasting, and prayer. And while that's true, the Pilgrims had their first Thanksgiving festival in December 1621, but they would not have had a second Thanksgiving festival if it hadn't been for a significant time of prayer and fasting they had. In fact, in 1623, they were suffering through a prolonged and extended drought period, and knowing that if they didn't get some change in the weather, they weren't going to have any crops for the coming fall, and they would all be dead. They'd be filled with death and starvation as they had been for the previous year. And so Governor Bradford called the Pilgrims to a time of fasting and prayer to seek God's direct intervention. And significantly, almost immediately at the close of that time of fasting and prayer, and to the great amazement of the Indians who were watching, because they'd never seen people fast and pray like these guys were, clouds appeared in the sky, and a gentle and a steady rain began to fall, and the drought was broken, and the rains continued throughout the next few weeks, and they produced an abundant harvest. And so Governor Bradford called for their second Thanksgiving, a Thanksgiving that would not have happened if the Pilgrims had not had the time of fasting and prayer before that. Now, the Pilgrims had learned to call for times of prayer and fasting from the same source that taught them about the free enterprise system, elected government, private property rights, education for their children, equal civil rights for everyone, and all these other practices we still have today that came from these guys. And what was the source of all of their ideas on this? It was this right here. This actually is a book that they brought to America. This is a Geneva Bible. This happens to be from 1590. And it has actually birth and death dates of the pilgrims in here, from kids born in 1627 and 1629. But this is the Geneva Bible. In fact, if you look at the picture that hangs inside the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, it shows the pilgrims gathered around Geneva Bible, just like this. Now, the one thing that made this Bible distinctive from all other Bibles in existence at that time were the marginal commentaries. These are commentaries on the Scriptures down the sides here. These are commentaries on the Scriptures that came from the prominent religious leaders in Europe at the time who were challenging the corruption of the culture in Europe, and they're pointing out specifically where the culture of that time was different from what the Scripture said. It was from these commentaries that the pilgrims learned things that changed not only their culture and changed America, changed the world. And it was in this Bible and these commentaries that they read and faithfully learned that there was a whole lot in there about the importance of prayer and fasting. For example, if you remember when Ezra was leading the people back to rebuild the temple, a really big deal, the king offered him military protection, but Ezra said, no, our God's going to help us. And so he had the people stop and fast and pray, and God did indeed help them. And if you remember the story of Nehemiah, he fasted and prayed before he returned to rebuild the walls. Everyone thought he couldn't do it, but that fasting and praying led to a strategy that produced a result that we'd marvel at in history. Esther, you remember when her people were facing destruction, Haman and the enemies were going to kill them, she called for a time of fasting and prayer. God heard, God saved them from their oppressors. And when Daniel was thrown in the lion's den, remember after the king's official had come up with this little trick to get the king to pass a law that'd single out Daniel and put him in the lion's den, the king spent the night fasting and praying that God would deliver Daniel, and guess what? God did. And remember Jonah was sent to tell the people of Nineveh that God was going to destroy them for their wickedness? They all humbled themselves and fasted and prayed, and guess what? God didn't destroy them. He spared their land. Jesus, here's a guy who changed the face of the world. He started his ministry with 40 days and 40 nights of praying and fasting. So literally, you see throughout the Scriptures that this ministry that changed the world, the pilgrims studied all this. They saw this. They saw the message about fasting and prayer out of the Bible, and they saw the effectiveness of it. And so it was really clear for them. And so after the pilgrims said that, that's where we got started. Now, they provided clear direction. They had clear direction of what they needed to do, and that was to fast and to pray, and that's what they did. And God graciously answered. Now, this precedent of the pilgrims calling for a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer, followed by a day of thanksgiving in the fall, it was picked up by the other New England colonies. They started times of prayer and fasting in the spring and Thanksgiving in the fall, and this became part of their annual official calendar. But this tradition of setting aside times for fasting and prayer, it was only in the New England area. It only began to move south in the other colonies when the American Revolution came out. At that time, Congress found itself facing really insurmountable odds. I mean, here's a bunch of farmers and shopkeepers taking on the superior British military. So what did Congress do? They called the nation to a time of fasting and prayer. John Adams told his wife Abigail about the very first national day of fasting and prayer. He told her, he said, Abigail, he said, we have appointed a continental fast. He said, millions will be up on their knees at once before their great Creator, imploring His forgiveness and blessings, His smiles on American counsel and arms. And shortly after that day of fasting, John wrote Abigail and said, you're not going to believe the stuff that's been happening. He went through a list of remarkable and otherwise unexplainable events that they had seen as a result of that time of national prayer and fasting. But it wasn't just John Adams who talked about it. Many other founders did as well. And they were quick to testify of really personally seeing God's intervention in the affairs of the Revolution. In fact, following National Day of Prayer and Fasting, by 1778, and we'd had several by then, George Washington himself had so witnessed God's intervention that he wrote fellow General Thomas Nelson, who was also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he told Thomas, he said, Thomas, he said, the hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked, that hath not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. Now, according to Washington, the hand of God was so apparent that if someone had seen what so frequently occurred in America's behalf during the Revolution, and if they did not personally feel an obligation to thank God with gratitude for all He had done, then Washington said that person's simply wicked. That's strong sentiments. But so too was Washington's unequivocal conviction that America's liberties were under the watchful eye of God. Significantly, on 15 separate occasions during the American Revolution, Congress called the nation to pray. 7 times for fasting and prayer and 8 times for Thanksgiving, back and forth. And in fact, this early book right here, this documents that by 1815, from the various state governors and presidents, by 1815, we had 1,400 official government-issued calls to prayer. Almost half of that for days of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, and the other half for days of thanksgiving and prayer. So here we are facing a crisis right now, and what do we do with this election? Well, we do exactly what happened throughout history. We fast and pray. We seek God's mercy. We ask His forgiveness and His direct help and intervention. But let me be real clear. The fact that we are seeking God does not mean that we have to sit idly by and do nothing more. No, it's actually quite the opposite. I have a friend who says, you don't lean on your shovel and then pray for a hole. Literally, we don't. God has placed things in our hands, things that we can definitely do. And we absolutely have to pray, no question about it. But we also have to do some other things as well. I think John Hancock, who, by the way, called his state to prayer on 22 separate occasions, governor of Massachusetts, 22 times, he fully understood this responsibility, and he therefore charged the citizens in his day. He said this, I conjure you, or I urge you, by all that is dear, by all that is honorable, by all that is sacred, not only that you pray, but also that you act. Well, we can and we must act on November the 6th by casting our vote, and we can and must act before then by making sure everyone around us is registered to vote, that they have voters' guides, and that they show up and vote on Election Day to preserve the nation. But until then, we can and we should fast and pray in the remaining time leading up to the election, the remainder of this 40 days.